Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I think they say in Mandarin, Huan Ying and Wu An. So, thank you very much. Yeah. Mrs. Chong, the chairperson of the Lenpung Colloquium Committee, Mr. Lim, who is there, ex-chairman of the Lenpung Colloquium Committee, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a great pleasure to see so many of you here, and it overwhelms me. In fact, we were thinking that maybe next time we should hire something like the Suntec auditorium. We have a lot of people. And it's obviously because of the theme and the topic that we're discussing today. The terracotta finds have been the source of fascination and delight and wonderment to millions and millions of people. And so it's a great pleasure to have speakers with us who are experts in this entire domain of scholarship, discussion, debate. What I thought would be very, very interesting, and this is why I chose a title that is so broad, Lessons for All, is our three experts are going to be addressing the theme from different perspectives. But I thought not only in each of their perspectives, but also as a whole, there are so many lessons for all of us to learn and pick up as we hear their stories and as we engage with the Q&A later. Hence the title, The Terracotta Army, Lessons for All, which might have been a little bit confusing perhaps, and I apologize if the title was a little bit confusing. My very pleasant duty is just to welcome everybody here, especially the speakers and Mrs. Chong for having driven the theme and the topic and getting us these wonderful speakers. And what I'm going to do is going to hand over the proceedings now to my colleague, Professor Kwok Pen Chow, who is much more of an expert in these areas than I am, and whose Mandarin, of course, is absolutely more fluent than mine could ever be. So I'm going to hand it over to him to carry on with the proceedings, introduce the speakers, and then moderate the Q&A. Professor Kwok.
Thank you, Kapal. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. As you know, it has been going around in the media, especially social media, on the BBC program that is going to be launched tomorrow, entitled The Greatest Tomb in the World. And the media is picking up on one important point, that is, the presence of European in China could be dated back earlier to the Qing dynasty, of a possible presence of Greek sculptors or craftsmen, persons, or at least the terracotta statues in China. And this would date the presence of European emissaries in China early by some 400 years, because in Chinese historical records, it could be stated that the possible presence of Roman Empire emissaries were in China in about 3rd century CE. This will bring this back, of course, all the way to 3rd century BCE. Now, the argument there is, first of all, the size of the terracotta soldiers they are looking at. This is unprecedented in China. And secondly, the realism that you see in the human representation is also new. Plus, some evidences, such as the presence of European DNA in Xinjiang archaeological sites, as well as some of the subject matters of the terracotta statues that we see. Now, the discovery of the terracotta statues has been around for actually 42 years. Those of us, who have been, first of all, amazed by that, and also continuing having that image in our mind, that has been around for some 40 years. So we may think that we are somewhat familiar, somewhat, okay, we heard about the Qing dynasty, Qin Shi Huang tomb, we know the terracotta soldiers and so on. But the reality is that the discovery has been an ongoing one. There has been 3 major archaeological excavations, and there have been many other continuing discoveries, which we are very, very fortunate, extremely fortunate today, to have none other than the head of the archaeology section of the Qin Shi Huang Mausoleum Museum to address us to discuss about such issues. He will also discuss about that media report about the presence of possible Greek sculptors, or at least Greek statues in China at this point in time. And we are also very fortunate today to also have Professor Marcos Martino Torres, as well as Professor Patrick Quint, both from UCL. They are professors in archaeological science at the Department of Archaeology in UCL. And they will be also addressing us on the Qin Shi Huang Mausoleum. And this is going to be an afternoon of discovery for us. As I said, we may know the terracotta figures, but we actually don't really know about the continuing discoveries. Particularly in the case of the presentations by the professors from UCL, they are going to talk about the organization of production, where the source materials are coming from, as well as the analysis of the composition of the terracotta. And that may shed light on the way the tomb was organized, the way a project of this scale, was, how was it organized and implemented, and that may tell us quite a lot about the Qing society. So, first of all, I'd like to invite Professor Zhang to be giving us his presentation. The presentation will be in Chinese, and if you have questions and particular points that you'd like me to do the translation, I'll be pleased to do so. But otherwise, it will be very visual, so you'll be looking at all these images anyway. Thank you very much, Professor.
女士们、先生们，下午好！我是来自秦始皇帝陵博物院的张卫星。今天我在这儿非常感谢 SMU， 非常感谢联合早报以及联丰讲座邀请我来新加坡跟大家分享关于秦始皇陵的考古现发现的一些情况。谢谢大家。今天跟大家要分享的大概有这4个方面。首先，我们谈秦始皇陵，不可能离开它的陵墓的主人，就是秦始皇本人，离不开这个秦帝国。所以我第一个方面，我会给大家分享一下关于秦始皇、关于秦帝国的一些情况。第二个方面，我需要跟大家沟通一下、介绍一下关于秦始皇陵考古新发现的一些情况。第三个方面，我们就是通过这些遗迹来认识秦始皇所希望的，或者是他设计的身后生活的一些情况。第4个方面，我跟大家谈一下关于秦始皇陵的一些想法、一些问题、一些思考。谢谢大家。陵墓的主人是秦始皇。大家都知道，秦始皇他文献中间第一句话讲得很明确，他叫嬴政。文献中间还有的说法，他叫赵政，因为秦和赵是一家。另外，也许他因为出生于正月，所以叫赵政。那么秦始皇非常有意思，他统一了6国，建立了一个统一的大帝国。秦帝国的统一在中国历史上非常具有划时代的意义。那么秦始皇统一了以后，建立了一个中央集权的一个国家，那么开辟了中国2000多年的封建时代，开始了2000多年的封建时代。那么秦始皇还有很多创造性的一些功绩，比如说建立了创新了很多制度。另外，像钱穆先生也论述过，他的统一，秦帝国的统一，促成了中华民族的这个传承。另外，他还建立了、影响了中国2000多年来精神世界、精神文化的一个形成。但是秦始皇非常具有争议性，一方面他雄才大略，另外一个方面他集残暴、奢侈于一身，还有很多负面的影响。 但是无论如何，秦始皇本人以及他创造的这个大帝国，是我们研究秦始皇陵，是我们认识秦始皇陵的最主要的背景。那么第二个方面，我跟大家介绍一下关于秦始皇陵考古的一些基本的情况。因为考古学科某种程度上讲是通过物质材料来认识它的，通过物质材料放在时间、放在空间这个维度中间来认识古代社会的一门学科。首先，我们还需要认识一下关于秦始皇陵所在的位置，它位于亚欧大陆的东端，关中地区的中部。我们现在看到的这个地方就是秦始皇陵所在的位置，这是秦都咸阳，这是汉长安城。那么这个位置就是阿房宫所在的位置，这是当时几个主要遗迹的相对位置关系。那么秦始皇陵跟现在西安市的关系，现在这是西安市，那么秦始皇陵在这个位置，骊山的北麓。那么秦始皇陵是位于这个骊山的北麓，渭河的南岸，这是渭河，这是骊山，它介于渭河和骊山之间。那么秦始皇陵就位于这个地方。我们从另一个角度来看，秦始皇陵所在的这个区域南高北低，那么我们从不同的位置可以观察到秦始皇陵具有一个不同的景观。这个景观非常有意思，实际上某种程度上讲是决定秦始皇陵位于这个地方的关键因素。实际上某种程度上讲，这个刚才我们看到的山的最高点这个位置向北一条延长线，实际上就是这个陵墓的中轴线，然后在这个中轴线选取了这一点作为这个陵墓设置的关键点。所以从这个角度来讲，整个陵墓的展开，陵墓的设计的开展，实际上就是位于骊山的北麓这个山环水抱的一个地势下。那么广义的秦始皇陵实际上是整个骊山北麓地区，这个骊山所控制的这个区域跟秦始皇陵营建有关系的所有遗存的总和。那么狭义的秦始皇陵实际上某种程度上讲，只是在这个区域内跟埋葬秦始皇、跟埋葬秦始皇的礼仪进程、跟他那个丧葬礼仪有关系的所有遗存的整合。那么最核心的区域，当然就是在这个围墙围起来的这个坟墓所在的位置。那么考古学科某种程度上讲是一门介于自然学科和人文学科之间的一门学问。它虽然用现代的方法，虽然我研究的是一个古代的问题，但是某种程度上讲，我们需要利用现代的方法、现代的技术来做一些工作，特别是考古发掘。那么我们在这个区域做工作，首先肯定要秉持一种科学的态度，以及一些技术方法来做工作。我们对骊山北麓的这个区域，我们现在所看到的区域大概是90平方公里，我们对这个区域进行了系统的考古规划，进行了分区。然后每1平方公里在数字地图上都画了网格，我们在这个基础上做了很多工作，包括我们还建立了考古资料的信息系统。那么经过近几年的工作，我们对这个区域的主要遗存有了一个明确的认识。那么从考古角度来讲，因为我们是通过物质遗存来研究古代社会，那么我们实际上对秦始皇陵这个地区来说，我们需要对考古材料有一个基本的把握。那么近几年，我们对这些陵墓的丧葬遗存的内容有了基本的把握，比如说对墓室、对墓道、对墓上建筑、对墙垣、对门阙、对道路、对陪葬坑、对陪葬墓、对这个陵邑等等有了基本认识。除此以外，秦始皇陵还是一个工程技术的结晶，它集合了当时最先进的工程技术来建造、来做工作。我们还有一些重要的工程技术的发现，包括对排水系统，包括对地下的这种防护等等。那么这是一些考古的最基本的情况。 实际上，考古学科某种程度上讲，就是通过物质遗存来研究人类社会，来认识古代社会。我们的最终目标当然很远大，就是想复原古代社会，来认识人类社会发展的一些现象，甚至放大到认识社会发展的规律。但是实际上，可能还有很多困难。但是至少考古学科比其他学科更容易通过物质材料来研究，来做一些工作。实际上，这个墓葬某种程度上讲是人对死亡的一些思考的一个结果。其实每个人都有死亡，那么每个人可能对死亡都有所思考。那么这种思考的形式有很多，墓葬实际上是思考的物质形式。那么秦始皇陵某种程度上讲就是始皇对死亡的一种思考的物质的反应。我们设想一下，一个墓葬它应该满足一些最基本的功能，比如说它应该满足灵魂和肉体的居住或在这常住，另外还应该满足这个灵魂接受庆享，应该满足跟家族的这种融合，另外还能要满足他在地下身后的这个生活，衣食住行之类的东西，另外还需要有它的安全防护的一些措施。那么基于这个考虑，我们通过一些物质遗存来想象一下，来认识一下始皇对死后世界的认识。首先我们看，这是1908年日本人足利喜六拍摄的秦始皇陵的封图，能看出来这个陵墓像一个山的形状，而且这个陵墓还有一个中腰的一个结构。那么从上个世纪更晚一点的照片来看，这个结构还是比较明确的。那么我们通过技术手段把这个恢复到这个之前的这个状态，能看出来这个中腰的结构大概是这样子。那么揭开这个地表的覆土，实际上它下边是一个很复杂的台体建筑，很复杂的一个台体建筑。这个台体建筑，这个底边的东西长是250米，顶部的是120米，就是形成了一个很复杂的一个台形结构、台体结构。那么我们刚才提示大家看到的中腰，实际上某种程度上讲会有地面的建筑。实际上，假如说模拟复原的话，类似于大概是这么一个情况。那么揭开这个东西以后，才是地下的墓室。揭开这个东西以后，才是地下的墓室。我们通过现在的技术手段，基本上已经了解地下的墓室会是它有一个复杂的一个墓室，有一个四向的一个有4个向4个方向的墓道。这实际上是一个秦始皇他这个灵魂或者肉体常住的一个地方。那么目前为止，我们只能通过一些技术手段来了解到地下墓室有一个很复杂的这种空间。那么这个空间的范围大概东西长是175米，南北宽是140米，然后高度深度是35米左右。那么始皇的棺椁或者是他的陪葬的最主要的内容，就是放在这么一个巨大的空间里边。我们目前所知道的仅此而已。至于司马迁文献中《史记》中所说的以水银百川为江河大海，宫观百官这些东西，我们通过现在的技术手段还是没办法完全搞清楚的。那么这个区域、这个空间，实际上就是始皇的，无论是他的肉体还是他的灵魂或者魂魄，就是长期是在这个地方生活的。这是我们认识秦始皇陵丧葬遗存中间的最主要的部分。那么他的灵魂不仅要在这个地方生活，而且他还需要接受后人的祭祀。那么对秦始皇陵来说，他的祭祀是通过陵园以内大量的地面建筑来实现的。实际上某种程度上讲，他的灵魂会到这个地面建筑里边去生活，会接受 这个后人的祭祀，会接受后人的食品的奉献。我们在这个陵园范围内发现了，目前为止已经发现了有接近40万平方米的建筑。比如说，在这个区域内城以内，已经发现了有17万平方米的建筑。后面我会详细的介绍。那么在西内外城之间，发现了有12万平方米的建筑，12万平方米的建筑。那么在这个区域，也发现了有6.8万平方米的建筑。那么最主要的部分是这个17万平方米的建筑。那么文献中间甚至有记载，那么这个区域呢，有很多的后宫人员在这儿生活，会按时为始皇铺上被褥，背上洒扫的这个水，然后为他按时这个奉上饭食和新鲜的水果。实际上，这个区域就是他的灵魂要在这儿生活的地方。我们多年来对这个区域进行了一些重点的发掘。那么，这个建筑规模非常宏大，我们对这个区域的认识到目前为止还有一些局限。但是我们对这个建筑的基本的结构或者的复杂程度有了一个初步的认识。比如说，这个建筑的它的最底层，实际上就是我们现在看到的这个区域，它会满铺上青石，大型的青石，然后这是最底层，然后从最底层到第2层，在这个区域会有一个青石做的台阶，从底层上到第1层，上到第2层，然后从第2层再上到第3层。所以实际上最前面的这组建筑是一个大型的台基式建筑，规模相当宏大。那么我们通过考古发掘已经发现了在这个区域的这个青石铺的石板，比如说这个区域会满是用这种石板铺上这个满铺上去，然后从这个底层通过这个青石台阶一级级的会上到上一层的建筑。这个石板实际上用阴刻的站出来的这种变形的夔凤纹，这是目前为止我们在这个区域发现的最重要的礼制性建筑。还发现有壁画。我们都知道，在咸阳宫就是始皇生前生活的这个宫殿里发现壁画，那么在这个陵寝建筑中间也发现有壁画，而且发现有大型的瓦当，说明了这个建筑遗址非常宏大，规模非常复杂。另外一个呢，就是说古代的人生前是具足而居，死后具足而葬。那么始皇死后，他也希望他的家人会在这个区域里边继续生活。那么我们目前为止在这个区域发现了一些跟他的家族从葬有关系的一些遗存。但是最重要的遗存还是发现于内城以内，在这个区域发现了一些遗存。到目前为止，我们明确发现有99座中型、小型的陪葬墓，这些墓非常有意思，排列非常有规律。在这个区域呢，大概南北呈8列这样的排布下去，所有墓的墓道都指向封土。我们可以通过一个照片来看到，这是秦始皇陵的主墓，那么这是一个小型墓葬，这是这个小型墓葬的墓道会指向这个封土。那么另外一些墓葬也是这种情况。那么前几年我们经过发掘，发现了这些墓葬虽然没有发现尸骨，但是在墓葬的这墓室的部分没有发现尸骨，但是在这墓葬的填土中发现了大量的人骨。比如说在这个区域发现有大量的人骨，这些人骨其实有一个主要的特点，一个是凌乱，另外一个是不全，再一个是跟年轻的女性有关系。这印证了文献中司马迁在文献中记载的一个事实：始皇死后，20说后宫非有子者，就是没有生孩子的后宫，出言不疑，就是不准出宫，皆令从死，死者甚众，就是有很多后宫人员都被杀死了，然后就随葬到秦始皇陵。但是中间的过程可能很复杂，也很血腥， 但是这批遗存就解释了这条文献的记载。除此以外，陵墓中间还有大量的陪葬坑，这些陪葬坑跟始皇的地下的生活，跟始皇想象的地下世界有很大的关系。那么我就通过几个典型的陪葬坑跟大家介绍一下。那么到目前为止，我们在整个秦始皇陵范围内发现了接近190座陪葬坑，但是像兵马俑这样的陪葬坑，这样大规模的陪葬坑还是少数。它的陪葬坑的范围大约分这么几个地方。这么在外围的区域，这是兵马俑所在的位置，在兵马俑的和陵墓的中间还有一些小型的陪葬坑。那么在东北侧还有一些鱼池，有鱼池南岸还发现有一些陪葬坑。在陵墓的内侧，在内外层之间发现了一些大型的陪葬坑。最核心的区域，在这个封土下和封土的周边也有大量的陪葬坑。那么我们从这个下面我会从内向外介绍几个重要的陪葬坑。实际上这个几个陪葬坑也就是象征了这个始皇生活的地下生活的不同的侧面。首先我们看一下这个铜山马坑。铜山马坑是我们目前为止发现的在封土下的一个陪葬坑，是目前为止所有的陪葬坑中间最接近这个地下墓室的一个陪葬坑。他发现我们在这个坑里边，它很复杂的结构。铜山马出土的位置就在这个地方，只是其中的一小部分。当时出土的时候，这些已经被压成碎片，后来经过修复，复原出来了这2层铜山马。那么实际上，这个铜山马应该是很能代表当时这个工艺技术以及艺术水准的一些陪葬品，而且有很复杂的纹饰。比如说，这实际上是一种介于龙和凤、介于云气之间的一些纹饰。另外，在稍微离封土远一些的陪葬坑，还有这个6号坑，那么叫开陵06。它的陪葬内涵主要是这样子：它有一个斜坡墓道，有个前室，有个后室。在前室主要是发现了有这些陶俑，一共有12件陶俑。这个地方有一个车基，有个战车。那么在后室这个部位是大量的马骨。基于这种认识呢，实际上某种程度上讲，这个陪葬坑可能还是跟始皇的出巡或者始皇的这种马厩有很大的关系。我们看到这件陶俑实际上就是驾车的这种御手。那么这些人员呢，这种人员就是车上的乘员或者随从。实际上这批陶俑是很有意思的。另外一个比较有意思的陪葬坑是我们在内外层之间东南部发现的一个陪葬坑。前几年这是12年，我们进行了整体发掘。这些是已经陶俑或者是遗存已经提取上来的结果。我们在这个区域发现了大量的陶俑，另外还发现了有烧融化的青铜鼎。实际上这个坑后期经过很严重的破坏。最重要的是，我们在第3条过洞发现了大量的陶俑的碎片。那么这种通过现场的遗迹的分析，我们发现这些陶俑实际上排列是有规律的。这实际上主要的陶俑分为2列，然后还有一个陶俑是在处于中间的部位看着这2列陶俑。那么这些陶俑修复了，我们目前已经对个别陶俑进行了修复。这些陶俑最有意思的是这批陶俑仅仅身穿一条短裙，它的下肢和上身是赤裸的。其实最有意思的是，这些陶俑表现了人体的肌肉，但是肌肉的背后某种程度上讲是骨骼，是对人体结构的了解。那么这批陶俑非常有意思，虽然这个到目前为止我们没完全修复起来， 将来如果修复起来，我们可以回到场景里边，可以回到这个整个陪葬坑的这个氛围里边，来认识这批陶俑的真实的作用。另外还有一件陶俑是这种坐在一个凳子上的一个陶俑。那么这一个区域呢，实际上是秦始皇陵范围内很有意思的一个区域。现在的地理环境，这个区域有很多河流，有一条河流是个洼地，现在的名词叫鱼池。水经注对这个河流、对这个区域有所记载。水经注认为是秦始皇陵修陵，把这个地方在这块取土，导致的这个地方淤深，形成了洼地。但是实际上可能并不是这样子。我们在这个鱼池水这个洼地的南侧，特别是这座陪葬坑，它的主要遗存内容分为2类。第一类是这种用青铜做的水琴，那么这水琴分3类。像这一种是鹤，另外一类水琴是天鹅，第3类是鸿雁。这3类水琴，除此以外呢，还有这是鹤修复起来的，这是天鹅修复起来的情况，这是鸿雁修复起来的。除此以外呢，还有发现有陶俑，2类陶俑，一类陶俑是这种坐在这一个平板上的。另外一类陶俑做这个姿势，其实综合陶俑和这个水琴，实际上这个陪葬坑表现了一处像是苑囿的情况。那么结合这个水环境，实际上鱼池水环境加上这些陪葬坑，表现了实际上是一处苑囿。那么除此以外，在这个陵园的外围，我们知道就是最著名的兵马俑陪葬坑。兵马俑一共有3个坑，这是1号坑的。1号坑，这个目前为止我们已经修复起来了1200多件陶俑。那么除1号坑以外，还有2号坑，还有3号坑。兵马俑坑它最主要的内容是军事内涵，它有大量的兵器，有战士，有武士。那么这些组成了整个陵园的保卫的内容。还有一些陶俑正在修复，将来会展示到前面去。所有的这些内容，实际上我觉得组成了始皇所想象的地下生活的一些侧面，有出行的内容，有保卫的内容，有他的灵魂这个出游，在禁院里这个游玩的内容。另外还有很多的内容都可以归到这个类型中间去。那么综合这些发现，秦始皇陵所表现的内容是哪些，或者主要的主题是哪些？那么从某种程度上讲，我们通过前面的分析，或者是通过对陵园整个形制的认识，我们可以看出陵园具有规整的一个结构，它有一个中心的部分，那么还有一个从中心向四方去的，所以中心和四方形成了很典型的关于中国、关于内、关于外、关于四方的一个结构。那么由四方到中心，还可以细分出向另外的方向，由4到5到9，甚至到12的这个概念。实际上，这是文明中间很典型的一个关于这个天下模式的一个理解。除此以外，秦始皇陵还有一个多层环绕的形式。比如说，我们现在看到这个陵墓最核心的区域是在这个区域。那么除此以外，在这核心之外，这是兵马俑的位置，这是鱼池的位置，这是一些小型的陪葬坑，这是西侧的大型的墓葬。那么这些区域、这些遗存所在的范围也同样有意义。这是秦始皇陵的第2个范围。那么实际上最大的范围就是刚才我说的 整个骊山所控制的这个区域。那么这个区域是秦始皇陵规划建设最大的范围。那么这个范围实际上某种程度上讲，也是秦始皇所理解的一个局部的或者一个微缩的天下有很大的关系。那么如果复原出来，秦始皇陵在骊山北麓地区大概就是这个样子，所以实际上是某种程度上讲，这是始皇主观或者想象中一个典型的一个天下、一个帝国的一个存在。另外，这个秦始皇陵的修建，包括咸阳城的修建，某种程度上讲跟天象都有关系，跟天象有关系。实际上，这实际上是对他的权力的对他权力和天的联系，然后实际上是这个某种程度上讲，这个陵墓实际上是对他统治这个秦国的统治的一种认可或者一种理解。我们都知道这个咸阳宫、咸阳城的修建有个法天象，就是象征了天象。那么实际上秦始皇陵的修建也跟这个咸阳城的修建有很大的关系，所以这实际上是整个这个时代跟天人结合的一个产物。这是我对秦始皇陵的一些理解。谢谢大家。
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Professor Zhang has shown us that, in fact, when we start thinking about the whole mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, it is really the whole astronomy, cosmology, the world, as in Tianxia, under the heaven, as a kind of idealized world of Qin Shi Huang. And the continuing discovery is aided by digital technology, such that we are able to have greater detailed information in a very comprehensive picture. So the archaeological research has taken further from just the excavation to thinking about philosophy, ritual, society. And also, the discoveries are not limited to only military elements, but also, other social figures, and also even his internal palace life will all be captured. We will have probably some questions for Professor Zhang, which we will do later on. I'm now very pleased to invite Professor Torres, who will now give us some detailed information on the organization of the production of the terracotta soldiers, and of course other aspects of the tomb. Thank you very much, Professor Torres.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm very honored and very pleased to be contributing to this event, and also very grateful for the opportunity to come here to learn more about your fascinating country and its fascinating people. My presentation is going to try to give you some highlights of an ongoing collaborative project, which is jointly running between UCL and the First Emperor's Mausoleum Site Museum. And so it is certainly important for me to emphasize right from the beginning that I am very privileged to be presenting this work to you today, but this is by no means my work alone. It is the result of collaborative work by many individuals, both in the UK and in China, too many to name individually, but all of whom are behind the work I'm representing here now. The presentation by Dr. Zhang has done, among many other things, an excellent job at providing us with a broader context for the famous Terracotta Army. We all now understand how this is just a very famous, but a relatively small, indeed a satellite component of a much larger site. The funerary city, the mausoleum where the first emperor of China was buried. So in these pictures you can see what the Terracotta Army means, the main mound where the emperor is buried, and over 50 square kilometers of a city, all of which was built for a single person, Qin Shi Huangdi. This is a much later portrait, but just to give you an idea of this very peculiar character who got it all built by himself in a very short period of time, between 10 and 30 years maximum, who had this whole city built for himself. To give you an idea of scale, you could fit the botanical gardens of Singapore 10 times in the mausoleum. And so all of this was built for a single person, for his afterlife. And so I'm sure some of you will have been to the Terracotta Army site. And I always find two types of visitors there. There are on the one hand those people who are particularly taken by the individual sophistication and dexterity that you see in specific objects. Like you can take any individual warrior and admire the detail with which the facial features are depicted, the pigments on their face, etc., etc. And other visitors are more impressed by the sheer scale, the magnitude of it. Thousands of warriors in a massive pit, in an enormous mausoleum, and so on. The Imperial Logistics Project, where I'm working, is trying to, in a way, reconcile those two extremes, or investigate the relationship between both. How is it possible to mass-produce something so unique? How was it possible to orchestrate all the raw materials, all the man and women power, all of the ideas, all of the knowledge necessary to create something so special and so large in such a limited amount of time? How was it possible to put it all together? So that's what we are investigating. That's what Imperial Logistics is about. So we are in a management university, and in a way what we're trying to investigate is ancient forms of managing people's materials, ideas. So maybe there's some lessons for all there, though I'm not quite so sure. I will try. Anyway, the way in which we are trying to achieve these largely is by doing a reverse engineering of the warriors and their weapons. We're trying to figure out how they were made. And as I said, the materials, ideas, and organization behind those. And we're doing the reverse engineering often by trying to identify batches. Those are the output of individual production events. That is, all of the objects that come from a same mold or from an individual workshop or individual crucible load. We identify those, and then we try to see how those were moved from the workshop to the site. And we will be focusing particularly on pit number 1 of the Terracotta Army because it's the most extensively excavated area, the one we understand better, even though we're hoping to make inferences for the broader site, and indeed, in due course, extend there. Now, what's peculiar, of course, is that we are trying to do a reverse engineering. We're trying to understand the technology, and we have no workshop remains. And so we've had to be quite creative in coming up with methods that would allow us to do this, primarily combining, as we will see in practice and through examples, material science together with studies of shapes, with the study of inscriptions in some of these artifacts, and then looking at the spatial distribution of all of these various variables. And I'll try to illustrate how we do that in practice. And a lot of my examples will be drawn from the study of the bronze weapons. As I'm sure many of you will know, and as Dr. Zhang was emphasizing earlier, our terracotta warriors were, of course, heavily armed with bronze weapons. And we have fascinating swords, daggers, lances, spears, halberds, and so on and so forth, in an excellent state of preservation, each of which is interesting in their own merit, even though I won't really have the time to detail all of them. I'll give you some examples of how we use them for our research. But before we get there, it's also important to understand the structure and the layout of this pit number 1, because I'll keep referring back to it. And as you probably know, the Terracotta Army pit is organized in these corridors. So there is the front row with several warriors, and then several corridors separated by walls. This is just so that you can understand then how we can use geographic information systems to then plot the distribution of those warriors. So this would be the front of the Terracotta Army pit and those various corridors. And you can begin to understand the battle formation strategy, how different types of warriors are organized or located in different ways, with robed ones on the front, armored ones behind, charioteers, and so on. And then we can overlay on top of these map the distribution of the different weapon types that we have there. And I won't expect you now to digest all of the individual details, but you can see just in one snapshot, for example, how the red and the black, which are the triggers for the crossbows, and the bolts, the arrowheads, how they are distributed primarily on the front and then on the flanges, on the sides of the battle formation, whereas longer weapons such as lances, spears, swords are more in blue towards the back. So we could study the military formation strategies, if you like, that may have to some extent explain the success of Qin, but that's not really what we are into in terms of our project. We're simply looking at this as a human creation that happens to be an army, and we're trying to understand how it was put together, how labor was organized to make this possible. And so this is where our work comes in, and I will start from the weapons perspective, if this moves, yeah, by focusing primarily on two types of bronze weapons, where I'll spend a few minutes. We will have, on the one hand, and they are both related, of course, on the one hand, the arrowheads or bolts that would be thrown from the crossbows, and on the other hand, the bronze triggers that would release those arrows in the crossbows proper. The crossbows themselves, fascinating as they are, they were made of organic materials, of wood, and so typically they have not been preserved. Let's start with the arrowheads. There are as many as 40,000 of these recovered so far, so it's a staggering collection, and therefore a fantastic one to study issues of mass production and organization of labor, as I was talking about. Now, every one of these 40,000 arrows is fascinating for loads of reasons. If you look at their chemical composition, for example, you can see how the alloys, the mixtures of copper and tin, have been optimized to get the best performance out of them. But also, every one of those 40,000 arrowheads has been sharpened on a rotary device. Hence, we have these very parallel striations or scratch marks on the surface. So it's the same that we find in our kitchen knives today, only that this is the earliest evidence we have for this. So each of those is really interesting, but I'll look at the broader perspective in a second. See if we can move. Now, in most cases, what we have preserved from these bolts is two metallic parts, the head proper and then the tang that would be inserted in a longer shaft. But based on better preserved examples, we can infer the various components that would be involved in the manufacture of a single arrowhead. We would have first the tang itself, then onto the tang would be fitted the head. The head would then be sharpened on these rotary devices, as I was saying. So I'm having a bit of trouble. Afterwards, there would be a linen cord wrapped around the tang. Then would be a much longer bamboo shaft of about ½ a meter. And finally, the feather flexing at the very back of the arrows. So there are many components put together in each of those 40,000 arrowheads. And I'll come back to that. Let's now look at their dimensions. That plot there shows a scatter of 15 or 1,600 arrowheads measured, and you can see that they are almost identical in their dimensions, width by length. In fact, we can calculate the coefficient of variation for different series of those. Yes, so we can use numbers, and as you probably know, many of you, the coefficient of variation gives us an idea of the spread of any variables that we are measuring. And so we take random series of 250 arrows, and the coefficient of variation systematically falls below the so-called Weber fraction. The Weber fraction is the threshold below which our eyes cannot perceive dimensional differences. In other words, you can take any two of those 40,000 arrowheads, and to our eyes, they're all identical. Now, this is the extent of the absolute standardization that is achieved there. So therefore, a very puzzling question that I'll come back to. Then of great interest for us, as I will show in a second, is that these arrowheads, as many as there are, on the site, they tend to appear in groups of 100. Clusters on the floor of the site, there are groups of 100, that we interpret as the standardized contents of a quiver, the little sack that each of the archers or crossbowmen would be carrying. So we have groups of 100 arrows, as we can see in this frequency distribution diagram. And this is going to be a very useful analytical category for us, as you will see in a second. But overall, what you can see from this brief introduction to the arrows, you will agree with me that we have highly standardized items that are mass-produced in their thousands and made of multiple components. And therefore, a key question for us is, how was these organized? How was these achieved? And we started with a hypothesis that we would have what today we call the flow line production system. That is a very large factory divided up in smaller super specialized components which are joining together in a factory line. So we thought we could have a highly specialized tank production unit that would send then the tanks to the specialized head proper production unit, which will in turn send these in the assembly line to the polishing wheel where all of them would be sharpened. This would then have their feathers added, their bamboo shafts, etc. And so they would move along this very long production sequence to eventually being bundles in group of 100 and eventually sent to the Terracotta Army Pit. So this was our initial hypothesis, our model that we wanted to falsify or test against the data. And we're going to look at these hypotheses now in the light of chemical analysis. We have done hundreds of chemical analysis of these weapons in general and the arrowheads in particular using non-invasive, non-destructive portable X-ray fluorescence. I'm going to try to summarize our results for you very briefly. What we have in this plot here, if I can get it to show, there we are. On this plot here, that group there, we have the chemical composition in a simplified form of 20 arrowheads taken at random from one of those bundles of 100. So those groups that I was saying, the bundles of 100, we took 20 arrowheads, that's their composition. And you can see that they form a relatively tight cluster. So they are quite similar in composition to one another. And this impression is reinforced if we add another bundle of arrowheads. And you can see that, again, they form a relatively tight cluster. There will be outliers that we can explain later for a variety of reasons, but generally, each arrow has a chemical composition that's quite similar to the other arrows in the same bundle. And we can keep adding bundles of arrowheads, and that impression is reinforced, although, of course, we will begin to get overlaps between those various bundles, because at the end of the day, they're all bronzes with a little bit of lead. So they're broadly the same thing, but we seem to have slightly different compositional groups. And we think that each of those groups represents one batch. That is the contents of one crucible load. One melting pot of bronze was used to pour 100 arrowheads, and those 100 arrowheads remain together forever after, from the workshop to the Terracotta Army Pit where we find them today. So each bundle of 100 arrowheads represents one batch of metal for the heads and one batch of metal for the tanks, which I'm not showing the data, but show the same pattern. So with this idea in the back of our mind, we can revisit our initial hypothesis. And so we have thought about a specialized tank production unit, and that unit would produce batches of tanks, one, another one, and so on. Each of those with slightly different chemical compositions, represented here by colors. They would send these tanks to the head production unit, and perhaps on the way some of these batches would be mixed up, and then the heads would be added. A batch of heads, another one, each of those batches with different compositions. They would then be sent for filing and polishing, and sure, different batches would get mixed up there. And then they would move to the part of the assembly line where they are mixed with the batches of feathers and bamboos, etc., until they are assembled. But we would think that if we were following this model, by the time we have groups of 100 arrowheads, those various chemical batches would be mixed up. If we have a massive production and assembly line with different units working at different paces, and all of those parts joining one another, we would expect mixed batches. And this is therefore not the model we have here, because this is not what our data are showing. What our data seem to show instead is what's called today a cellular production model. We think that instead of a single very large factory and assembly line, we had much smaller and versatile production cells, each of which was producing not loads and loads and loads of heads or tanks, but the finished multi-component bundle of 100 arrowheads. So they would prepare 100 tanks, 100 heads, put them together, polish them, 100 feathers, bundle them together, and only once that bundled quiver was ready would they proceed to create the next bundle of 100 arrowheads. We think it's quite likely that there was not one, but several such cells operating in parallel and doing the same thing. So we would have to multiply the resources, because there is one polishing unit in this cell, another one here, and each of those cells has all the materials, all the molds, all the knowledge, all the resources necessary to create not one standardized part, but all the components of these multi-component items. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, but we do have a parallel in the modern world with all the caveats and risks of the modern parallel, but just for illustration, that might help us understand this. Now, our initial hypothesis would be comparable to the well-known Fordism, but there is another way of making cars, which is known as Toyota Production System, which is the way in which Toyotas are made, which is actually cellular. Each Toyota factory makes their own cars, and without going into the intricacies of these different labor management systems, basically a cellular production system requires more investment in each of those cells, but it means they are more self-sufficient, they are more versatile in case one breaks down, the other can continue. So if you're creating a terracotta army that nobody has made before, having these versatile, smaller cells that can move to from one task to another may have been a useful management solution. And this idea that I think appears to be quite convincing from the perspective of the arrowheads, we're beginning to see in other strands of evidence. And this is where I come into the triggers. Now, the crossbow trigger is a remarkable piece of engineering. It's made of various bronze components. This is a little video, but it seems not to work. It doesn't really matter. But anyway, it's a fantastic piece of engineering that allowed crossbows to throw arrows much farther away with more strength, precision, etc. But I won't have the time to go into this. What I'm looking into, again, is the production system. And we have 200 odd of these crossbow triggers made of several metal parts. And here what we did was looking at those parts and measuring them, trying to identify minute differences that might allow us to differentiate those parts of the triggers that would come from the same molds. And this is what we found. We found, focusing on those three major parts, we found that there are at least, there are at least 3 molds for part A, 4 molds for part B, and 4 molds for part C. So at least, as I said, a limited number of molds, but the outputs of these various molds are not mixed at random. If they were mixed at random, we would have 48 combinations, but we only have 8. So this suggests that we have possibly 8 production units, 8 workshops, and each of those is not just producing part A, but they are producing the finished crossbow trigger, perhaps already fitted in the crossbow itself. So again, the crossbows, and from a different perspective, now the morphometrics, are suggesting different production units working in parallel, even if they may be doing almost the same thing. So this is the little structure that we see beneath the standardization. But we can take this idea of the decentralization and the breaking up of the workforce, we can take it further if we look now at the spatial distribution. So we said there are 8 subgroups of triggers, potentially 8 production units. And we can look now at the spatial distribution of the output of one of those units. So this is again a map of the 11 corridors of the front of the terracotta army pit. And each of the black dots represents one crossbow trigger, the location of a crossbow trigger. In orange, we have one of those 8 subgroups. And you can see again the distribution is not random. We have clusters of about 5, possibly 1 batch, and all of those batches are located, in this particular case, to the northeast of the terracotta army pit, as if this was an activity area that was catered for by a particular production unit. We can look at the output of a different production unit, and we have a similar distribution, but in another area, again reinforcing this point. And this is basically a point correlation function plotted against a Monte Carlo distribution, simply showing that what we see here is actually statistically valid, that those distributions are clustered. So from several strands of information, both the chemistry and the shape studies, and these weapons and other weapons, we appear to have this decentralized distribution in production cells. And a key question here is, how are they managing to keep that very high standardization when production is distributed in different cells? And the answer to that comes from, among other lines of evidence, it comes from the inscriptions. Some of the bigger weapons, such as the halberds, have relatively long inscriptions that talk about who made the weapon under the supervision of who in what given year. If we put all of those inscriptions together, we can identify we can create these trees of hierarchical supervision going from the worker in just 4 steps right up to Lu Buai, who was the chancellor or the prime minister of the first emperor. So you can see that even if the production was decentralized, the supervision and the quality control was strongly centralized to make sure that nothing went off the model, nothing went off the expectation. And if something was not of the desirable standard, I'm sure they had very well demarcated ways of punishing those responsible. And so, as I said, I don't know how much we want to learn of this lesson, but it seems this was the way of managing people that made it possible to create at least the weapons of the Terracotta Army. Now, of course, you've come to an event that is about the Terracotta Army. I'm coming to an end. I'm not going to take too much more of your time. But I'm sure you want to hear about the Terracotta Army proper. And of course, we wanted to test if the same logistical model is applicable to the warriors themselves. And this is what we are working on at the moment. And you'll hear more about this when my colleague, Dr. Patrick Quinn, speaks next. But I wanted to just illustrate how we are trying to do these with the warriors. On the one hand, we are trying to do these through chemical and petrographic analysis of the warriors. So something comparable to what I illustrated with the arrowheads, we're hoping to do with the warriors, but that's what Dr. Quinn will be talking about. Equally, another strand of evidence we are using to understand the logistics of this production is looking at the inscriptions in the warriors, just as we were looking at the inscriptions in the weapons. This is a study that we've only just published based on a detailed analysis of the various workers' and supervisors' marks that we find in a good number of the warriors. I will not go into a lot of detail, but what you can see, if you look at the spatial distribution of different makers' marks, you can generate maps like these, which can be quite complex to start with, and we won't have the time to now look into the fine-grained detail. But basically, you can look at different place names. You can look at where in the warriors those marks appear, whether it's the arm, the back, etc. And look at the distribution across the site of those variables. And you begin to see clusters of marks that look similar on warriors that look similar. So again, it seems that we do have several production units, several cells, several workshops, if you want to call them, working in parallel to create this, and not just a single very large factory. Something that, of course, makes sense in that you could have, as I said, a much more versatile and adaptable workforce, one that could accommodate changes in the plan more easily, one that could accommodate breakdowns much more easily. And so we're looking at that through petrography, as Patrick will present, through the marks, but also we were hoping, and I will finish with this, we're hoping to gain information from the shape analysis. Now, you will have seen how in the study of the crossbow triggers, by looking in very detailed form at the shape of the objects, we can identify groups, which in that case we assign to individual molds and then production units. So you could see how the study of shapes of objects could be quite useful for our purposes. So we were hoping to do something similar with the warriors, to take different axes that we could measure. So in a way similar to the crossbow triggers, we could measure different dimensions that we could take from the anthropological literature, and then we would have a lot of numbers from those various axes that we could run our multivariate statistics on, and perhaps identify individual warriors that might come from the same workshop, perhaps from the same mold, or if not even attempt to discern different racial or ethnic features in there. Now this was again our perhaps naive expectation, because of course we have to remember that the warriors in the pit are packed very tightly together. We were never going to be allowed to climb over the warriors with our measuring tape to take all of those measurements. It was just never going to happen. And so again, we had to be somewhat creative in an approach to this. And what we've ended up doing was not working with the warriors themselves, but actually with three-dimensional digital models of those warriors. Now, we are using a relatively new technology, which is structured from motion, which is not like 3D scanning. It's something slightly different, cheaper, more versatile, which is creating three-dimensional models based on digital photographs. So we have different camera locations. We just take a lot of digital pictures of the warriors, create point clouds from those, and we can then create these wonderful three-dimensional models. So we can upload these online so that people can engage with them. We can 3D print warriors, but also we can do what we are meant to be doing, which is comparing their shapes. So if you look at this 3D model of that head, for example, this head is, of course, made of loads and loads of dots. This head alone has 250,000 dots. Without touching the warriors, we can now measure and compare the distances between any of those dots. And this is something we are still developing. So far, we've only published, as it were, the proof of concept, because our sample is quite limited. We need to acquire more of these 3D models. But we illustrated this initially with the study of the ears of a number of warriors. And the ears are very interesting for many reasons. One of them is that the ears are as individual as our fingerprints. There are no two ears that are the same. All of the ears in this room are different from one another. Seriously. It's just that they are not so frequently recorded as the fingerprints because they are more difficult to record because they are three-dimensional. And that is the challenge that we had to confront. And I think we've succeeded in doing that. So we created 3D models of ears for that reason, to see how individual the warriors might be, but also because there's a whole school in the history of art that claims you can identify workshops based on the ears they produce. So you can differentiate the work of Botticelli from that of Filippino because of their ears. It was Giovanni Morelli who started this school in the history of art, which is somewhat questionable, but we thought it would be interesting to test from a scientific perspective. And so we started with this initial pilot study, which I said is not finished, because we've only been able to compare 40 ears so far. And our population of 7,000 or so warriors, we cannot claim to have a representative sample. But what we can say is that our method works, which is certainly an encouraging beginning for us. What our results show so far, but once again let me insist they are only initial preliminary results in a very small sample, is shown here. Basically in this multidimensional scale plot, we have 40 ears. Each ear is represented by one dot. And the closer the dots are in this space, the more similar they are morphologically. And what's interesting and tantalizing, and what the media got crazy about, well beyond our hands, and we can perhaps discuss later what the media do with the claims that archaeologists make. Basically, what this shows is that no two ears are the same, so there's no perfect overlap between any pair of ears, but most of the ears are quite similar to one another without being identical. And then there are a few outliers, ears that are very big or very concave or very peculiar in their shape. And so what was very suggestive of this is that this is the same distribution that we might expect, for example, in a population like the one we have here today. No two ears are the same. Most of our ears look similar, and then a couple of us have ears that are exceptionally big or small, etc. So this made it very tantalizing whether the army could have been individual portraits, etc., etc., etc. It reignited that debate, which I think is not totally solved. We cannot really be conclusive given the small sample. But let me wrap up then. I think that hopefully this very quick tour will have shown to you the potential of combining in a single project the study of the materials, the shape of the warriors, their weapons, and their distribution in space, how we can infer from those the imperial logistics, the labor management, and how it appears to be, the answer to our question, it appears to be a decentralized production system under a very centralized supervisory control. Whether that workforce was Greek or Chinese is again something we can discuss later. I will leave it out for now, but welcome to engage with it later. And finally, of course, this open question as to whether what we have here truly is a real army for the afterlife, which, as I said, is being reignited by the fact that we have very realistic weapons that are lethal, that are very highly standardized, and rather realistic warriors, it would seem, in that they are not quite so standardized. But this is a question that I will leave for us to ponder. But I'll leave it at that, not before I once again thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martino Torres. Thank you for helping us to explain that why SMU is so interested in archaeology and humanities in general, actually. We think management actually covers all aspects of life. Now, 刚才我们听到的是 Torres 教授，从这个兵马俑的布局、阵势、分类、物质形态各方面的分析，让我们了解到整个这个兵马俑的工程跟这个整个生产的过程。这个就让我想起我们常常说， 严阵以待这样的一个形容。那整个兵马俑的这个阵势呢，就是在地底下严阵以待。那我们下一个主讲者呢，是 Professor Patrick Quint， 他也继续的从这个工程以及这个制造的这个组织的过程来分析我们整个这个兵马俑的这个大型工程。So, Professor Patrick Quint, we are all ears on you.
Thanks for the introduction. So following on from from the general introduction by Professor Zhang and then Marcus's introduction to the Imperial Logistics Project, I'm going to focus on some new research on the ceramics of the warriors themselves using scientific material science techniques. So despite the terracotta army being studied for so many years, being familiar to most of us, many questions still remain about how they were produced. We know on a macroscopic scale how the statues were probably put together, but there are many other questions that we don't understand. It's usually assumed that the warriors were made on site, that they wouldn't have they would have made them close by the mausoleum rather than making them somewhere else and transporting them. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to find any kilns with debris, with the remains of the warriors in them. And also, if you look at the composition of the materials which they're made out of, there's been some studies looking at the chemistry of those, and there seems to be a mismatch between the warriors themselves and the chemistry of the local clay sources. There have been some kilns found, but these contain tiles rather than fragments of warriors. And these findings have there have been suggestions based upon these findings that they could have been produced elsewhere, also that they weren't actually fired in a kiln, that they were fired in a bonfire. So clearly there are lots of questions remaining about their production location and their firing. Also, something I'm interested in is how the material that was used to make them was put together, because this is an essential step in producing any kind of ceramics, is preparing what we refer to as the paste recipe. So there have been suggestions that unmodified local clay was used, and also that it is modified in various ways. So I hope to clarify some of these steps. This is just an artist's reconstruction of the macroscopic large-scale manufacture of the warriors. This kind of information is quite obvious, how they were physically built up on a macro scale. And these are some of the results from previous chemical studies of the warriors and local clay materials. So these are the results of studies of chemical research on the warriors themselves and local clay samples. And as you can see, I've highlighted there's actually a mismatch between the local clay and the chemistry of the warriors. Most of these published in Chinese. As Marcus has introduced, we believe that the details of how the terracotta warriors and other aspects of the mausoleum were put together, their technology, are going to be key to understanding how the mausoleum was realized, the labor organization, the relationship between the various crafts, and will also give us insights into Qin period China in general. As he said, we're investigating the ceramic technology of the warriors and the organization of ceramic production in several ways. Material science studies, such as the one I'm going to present now, also morphometric data, and paleogeographic, that means spatial analysis in the past, so within the pits, for example. And some key questions we would like to address are how many workshops were involved, what was their size, what were their different roles, what were their political affiliations. There have been suggestions that local workshops as well as state workshops were working on the same project. I'm also interested in links between different crafts at the site, so links specifically between the different types of ceramics. So the first step in this, and this is the initial data I'm presenting, is a very rather small data set, but to give us a first glance at these sorts of issues. What I've studied is 12 fragments of different terracotta warrior statues coming from pit 1. 2 of the acrobat statues, which we saw was in pit K9901. And I've also looked at, so the bottom of the pits of pit 1 particularly had lots of bricks lining the bottom, and these are made out of clay. So I've studied some of those. The pits had, and also the mausoleum itself had these rammed earth walls, so walls built up by compacting earth, clay. So I've studied a sample of that. Also, the bronze waterfowl, these bronze birds that were excavated from pit K007, they had clay within inside them, so some of the clay core material we have also analysed. So how have we studied these? Taken a very scientific approach called thin section ceramic petrography. What you do is you have to impregnate the sample with glue to hold it together, and then you slice it down to 0.03 millimeters thickness and mount it onto a microscope slide. And at that thickness, you can shine light through ceramics, rock, and other kinds of earthy materials. And you can look at the minerals that are present within them. You do this with an optical microscope. So thin sections have been made of all these samples. They were studied under the microscope and grouped according to their composition, according to the minerals that are present, the nature of the clay. We're trying to I believe ceramics should be viewed, the paste of ceramics should be viewed as recipes. So I've tried to focus on the recipe that was used for these different types of ceramics, the different warriors and the various other ceramics on the site. It's a visual, qualitative approach, but we've also collected detailed quantitative data by measuring the size of the individual mineral fragments within. Let me show you what that's. So here's pit 1. Some of the artifacts that we've studied. These are the acrobats. This is the bronze bird, which has got clay core material inside it. These are some of the bricks in pit 1 and an area of rammed earth. Actually, this is not the one we studied. This is from the walls around the burial mound, but it's a wall made out of the pounding of clay with wooden shutters around it. These are some of the samples in the laboratory before I had the pleasure of slicing them up. So this is a hand of one of the warriors. Here's one of the bricks. And this is the technique I've been using. So these are thin sections. These are about 75 millimeters long. It's a regular microscope, glass microscope slide, and the brown that you can see on top of them are a very thin piece of the artifact, in this case of a ceramic. And this is what thin sections look like down the microscope. So you're looking at about 2 millimeters across there. The brown stuff is clay, and the bright coloured particles are what we refer to as inclusions. They're little bits of mineral fragments left in the clay. They could be either there naturally or they could be added. We can also see holes as well. These are the thin white structures here are pores from the drying of the clay. So this is the approach, thin section petrography, which we applied. The slides are studied on a polarizing microscope. It's a technique taken from geology and applied to archaeological material. It's an optical microscope, and we attach it to a computer for measuring. So what about the results? Well, in thin section down the microscope, we can say that all of the ceramics that we've studied, the 12 warriors and then the various other ceramics, have all been produced from clay, which has got lots of very fine particles in it, referred to as silt. Silt are particles of a particular size, 0.002 millimeters to 0.63 millimeters. So silt-sized inclusions of the mineral quartz and a mineral called mica. Down the microscope in all the samples, we could see these conspicuous features that are suggestive of the possible mixing of two clay sources together. I'll show you that in a minute. One problem, though, is that you can get similar features occurring naturally in clay. So I'm not too convinced that mixing was necessarily going on, but there's a suggestion of it. In terms of raw materials, the initial thought is that the clay could have been procured from the loess in the area. This is wind-blown, clay, silty material that covers a lot of central China, the Loess Plateau. So probably our assumption and the assumption of previous studies is that was what was being used to manufacture the ceramics. And I'll talk more about that later on. It covers Lintong is right on the edge of the Loess Plateau. And this kind of material was very abundant and used for we think for the production of other sorts of ceramics throughout China, probably rammed earth structures as well. The previous chemical studies that I've mentioned compared the chemistry of the ceramics to the loess, but as I showed you on the graphs earlier, there was a mismatch actually between them. They didn't match chemically one another. So that's a question we need to answer. So this is what the ceramics looked like down the microscope, focusing here on the clay, the silty clay. So you can see the brown clay, and then these white particles are the quartz silt, and the elongate brown particles are the mica. Here we've got these clay features of a light-coloured clay containing lots of silt, and then a darker coloured clay with less silt and more iron. It's possible that they were mixing these two sources of clay together to produce a single paste. This is the Loess Plateau of central China. So this material, wind-blown, silty clay material, covers a huge area, of which Xi'an and Lintong is situated at the bottom. What I think has happened, though, they've used a single sort of clay, but then for the different, our findings suggest that for the different sorts of ceramic artifacts, they've treated this in different ways. The terracotta warrior statues themselves, and also the statues of the acrobats, they've taken this clay and they've added coarser, loose sand-sized particles. Sand is, we all know, we've all heard the term sand. Sand are grains between 0.6 millimeters and 2 millimeters. And I'll discuss in a bit why they've done that. So they've added sand to the paste and mixed it. So that's their recipe for the statues of the warriors and the acrobats. For the material within the core of the bronze birds, they've added sand, but they've also added chopped plant matter. So the recipe's got 3 components, possibly 4 there if they've mixed the 2 clay sources to begin with. For the rammed earth and the bricks lining the pit 1, they've just used this silty base clay without the addition of sand. I've used this word temper here. Temper is the intentional addition of particulate matter to clay, and identifying whether particles in ceramics occur naturally or whether they've been intentionally added as temper can be difficult. But there are certain pointers that we can use. One is the grain size distribution. If you measure lots of the grains within ceramics, naturally occurring clay sources have one mode. They have a dominant grain size and then lesser amounts of larger or smaller grains. When you add temper to ceramics, potters tend to add coarser material to a fine clay to alter its properties. So by doing that, they produce a material with 2 modes, with a coarse and a fine mode. So by measuring many of the grains down the microscope, we've been able to model the grain size distribution and show that it's in fact bimodal in the warriors and the acrobats, whereas it's unimodal in the rammed earth and the bricks, suggesting that temper was added. So why did they do that? Well, one reason you can do that is to make the clay more workable. If it's too clay rich and it doesn't have enough particles in it, then it's very sticky, and it wouldn't be very good for shaping into ornate sculptures. So they probably add tempering to reduce the stickiness of the clay. It also promotes the formation of pores within the ceramics. The terracotta warriors, the thickness of the wall can be up to 10 to 15 centimeters, and trying to get the water out of that takes a long time. So if you've got porosity, it speeds up the drying process, which would of course be necessary to produce many ceramics in a quick period of time. So it opens up, it produces this porosity through which water can evaporate via capillary action and then escape from the outside of the object. And a third possible reason is that by adding sand, you increase the strength of the object that you've made. And clearly, even if they were produced close to the pit, they would have been transported, the statues. So they want them to withstand shock. They don't want them to crumble or break and fail. So potentially sand temper was added for that reason. This shows you the various paste recipes that I believe we've got here. You can see these are sand size inclusions that have been added to a warrior statue. The same in an acrobat. This is the core material from the bronze birds. We use two types of light when we look at thin sections down the microscope. I shan't explain it, but that's why the two images look slightly different in colour. So here we've got sand added to the core material, but also these curved shapes are where plant matter was added, and it's burnt out during either the firing or the heating of the core when the bronze was added to it. And this is a brick without any sand temper. So you can see it hasn't got these large inclusions within it. It's just got the silty stuff that's present in the loess, probably what they used as a base clay. So this is the system I have in mind for the recipes of these various ceramic objects, potentially mixing of two clay sources to produce a base clay that was then treated in different ways according to the ceramics that were being produced. Sand temper added for the statues, sand and plant matter added for the core material, and for the bricks and rammed earth, just the regular base clay without temper. Here we've got this grain size distribution I was talking about. Marcus showed you a frequency distribution histogram. What it is, it's the abundance of a particular thing, in this case, of grains, of particles of a particular size. So in the silty brick, you can see that it's dominated by quite small grains, whereas in a tempered aqua warrior, in this case, we've got the silty material, but then we have a second mode of coarse particles that were added. And we don't get this sort of distribution occurring naturally. Natural clay sources tend to have a unimodal distribution. They may have a slightly larger grain size or smaller grain size, but they don't have these two modes. So that's evidence for tempering. Another piece of evidence is that we find areas in the samples where the sand wasn't entirely mixed in, so where it clumps, or there are areas where there is less sand. The composition of this material, this sand material, is really useful. It is helping us to determine geologically the sort of material that was used, and then also look for its source, as I'll get onto in a bit. The main mineral is quartz, as in most sand, but also we've got a significant component of other types of rocks. There's a lot of mineral names there. These are minerals. These are types of minerals, and then also types of rock. So you can have little fragments of rock. Geologically, this is a diverse sand, what we refer to as a juvenile sand source. It hasn't been transported very far. Otherwise, the softer minerals, the ones in addition to quartz, would have been removed. Also, it's polymixed. That means it's very diverse. It's got a diverse range of sources. Lots of rocks have been weathered, eroded in order to produce this sand. The plant matter that was added to the cores of the bronze birds, the possible function, there's two possible functions for this. One would be to, well, as I said, it's burnt out, as we can see down the microscope. That's either the core was fired before it was used, or it's during the heating when the bronze was poured into the mould. So they were made possibly by Lox wax, where they make a mould, and they put a wax sculpture on the outside that melts away and the bronze replaces it. So this potentially burnt out the plant matter. But it also, by the plant matter burning out, it would have made the core more porous but more light. And in the bronze waterfowls that have been excavated, the main body of the statue, the clay has been scraped out, but the neck section where we got our core samples would have remained in there because they couldn't get in there to scrape it out. So they would have wanted to reduce the weight of that clay material. So potentially the plant temple was added for that reason. Another reason is having porosity. Clay contains, when it's wet, it contains water, but it's also got water trapped within the clay minerals, chemically combined water it's called. And then when you heat it, this escapes. If it escapes too fast, it could affect the bronze being casted on the outside. So potentially allow that water to be vented, to be taken up by the mold. That's a theory I'd like to test further. These are some of the inclusions that we've got in the sand-tempered acrobats, core and warrior statues. This is a piece of granite made up of the mineral quartz and a mineral called microcline feldspar. This is a piece of metamorphic rock, a piece of sandstone, and this image shows you a diverse range of inclusions. So this polymixed sand of various origins. So here's an image of the bronze bird, and the sample we took came from the neck. The rest of it would have been scooped out, but they couldn't get to this clay material in here, so they would have potentially wanted to make it light so the statue wasn't so heavy. So about the firing, some people have suggested that one particular author that they weren't fired because they couldn't find kilns. Well, it seems likely that they were. They wouldn't have survived so long, over 2,000 years later. If they hadn't been fired, the clay would have degraded beneath the earth. One author found grains of pollen, so pollen from plants, trapped within the clay. And this can burn out at about 400 degrees C. And that is another piece of evidence to suggest to one author that they hadn't been fired. However, pollen needs oxygen to burn out. You could fire it to quite a high temperature, but as long as oxygen is absent, then the pollen won't be destroyed. So it's probably likely that because the walls are so thick of the warriors, the oxygen didn't penetrate during firing. It reached a high temperature, but oxygen didn't penetrate to dissolve, to degrade the pollen. Other evidence for the firing temperature we can derive by looking at the samples down the microscope in a special kind of light and rotating the sample. It's a thing called optical activity I'll demonstrate in a second. And if the clay shows this activity, that means that it's not vitrified, it hasn't turned to a glass. So the temperature is below 850 degrees centigrade. There's a particular mineral, a couple of minerals in the samples, in the sand, that change colour at particular temperatures, and we can also use those to estimate the firing temperature. One of them goes brown at 750 degrees C. So they may have been fired below that temperature. However, there's been quite a few studies on the firing temperatures of the terracotta army, of the terracotta warriors, and there have been conflicting numbers. So I've added to that mess by generating these numbers. But one thing to bear in mind is that the warriors could have been secondary fired. So the theory is that a warlord in late Qin period ransacked the site and set fire to the roofs. The pits were covered with these roofs, set fire to the roofs, and so potentially the burning of these could have refired the objects and resulted in a variation in the degree of firing in the various sculptures. That's something worth bearing in mind. It's likely that they were fired in a kiln. If you know anything about ceramics, being able to control firing, of which you definitely would need very good control of the firing to produce these life-size, very thick-walled statues and fire them properly so they're going to survive for millennia. You would need to have a kiln. Making a bonfire, an uncontrolled bonfire, so piling wood on top of the statues, as one author has suggested, is not going to do the job. It's going to you're going to end up with lots of failures because the temperature will rise too quickly and the ceramics will explode, or they'll be partly fired in one place or the other. So it's likely that they were fired. This is the looking at the optical activity of the clay itself. So the image here is the same, but it's been rotated. And you can see that the clay minerals are changing colour. This is because, well, they're minerals, and that's what minerals do when you rotate them in this special kind of light. But as they're still showing this characteristic, it means that the clay hasn't vitrified. It was below 850 degrees C. Near the mausoleum site, there are various workshops producing replicas, and I just show a picture of one of their kilns. It's likely that the warriors were packed into a kiln. They may have been fired in separate pieces like this, or fired whole. But there must be kilns nearby in which they were produced. So what about the organisation of production of what does our data from this, our findings from this small data set tell us about the organisation of production? We can see a link between different sorts of ceramics, between the acrobats, the warriors, the bricks, the core material, what else is it? The rammed earth, in terms of their raw materials, but they've been prepared in different ways. So if they were produced by different workshops, then they were linked in some way. As Marcus suggested, told you, there are these stamps that you can find on the warriors. There have been links found between stamps on warriors and stamps on tiles and drainage pipes on the site that suggest that different workshops producing different sorts of ceramics were somehow linked to one another. It's possible that these compositional and technological links in terms of the paste of the samples I've analysed support this existence of these multi-skilled cells of craftsmen that can be adapted to different tasks. So the same guys could have produced the warriors, the bricks, and so on. Another important possible finding is that as the core material was part of the production of the bronzes, then we've got interaction between two crafts, the metalworkers and the ceramics. So these are possible things to bear in mind. These are some of the stamps on the warriors and then also on tiles found at the site. And drainage pipes, actually I should be showing you a circular drainage pipe, but one of the theories about the formation of the warriors is that the legs were made using the same technology as the drainage pipes found on the site, spherical ones rather than this shaped one. And that may also indicate connection between different workshops producing different sorts of ceramics. These are Marcus's results about the cells. So we may have some evidence, very tentative, to support that. However, we could look at the data in a different way. An alternative explanation is that we had some kind of centralized clay extraction and processing, and then there were different workshops producing different sorts of ceramics, but they got their clay. The clay was supplied by a centralized workshop. As clay is the main ingredient of these 8,000 statues and numerous other ceramics at the site, this made sense if you want to produce things rapidly and you want them to be standardized and to survive, to have a high quality, then you need to control the raw material. If it was left up to each workshop to go and mine the clay, then it wouldn't have succeeded. So I think that they probably had strict recipes that were adhered to by the various workshops, and this was potentially controlled by decoupling raw material acquisition and processing of the paste from the actual manufacture, the forming, firing, and decoration of the warriors. So it's a theory I'd like to explore further. So there was a dedicated department dealing with the acquisition of raw materials. And this would ensure that we've always got clay. Without the supply of clay, the production of the warriors would have broken down. So huge amounts were needed at the site, not just for the warriors, but for the rammed earth and other artifacts. So some kind of system like this, if we see this as a centralized system of acquisition and processing, whether the processing, the addition of temper took place at the workshops or at this centralized depot, which I envisage, I'm not sure. By looking in detail at the paste, I have also shed some light on the production location, some extra light on the production location, which, as I told you, people assume is at the site. There was research on the chemical composition, which suggested that local loess was used. But this material covers thousands of square kilometers of central China and is very, very similar from one place to the other. So it's difficult to say whether they use the loess. From just studying the loess material itself, it's difficult to say whether they used the material right by the site or whether they produced it 100 kilometers down the road or in Xi'an. But studying this added sand temper in the warriors, acrobats, and the cores has given us extra information, geological information, which we can use to provenance to try and pinpoint the location at which the ceramics were produced. As I said, the sand has got this very diverse composition, many different rock types. If we look at the geology of Mount Lishan, which is just to the south of the site, very close by, you can see that those rock types and minerals occur there. And there are rivers coming down off the mountain and spreading out the sediment that they're carrying in these alluvial fans. And the mausoleum's built on top of the alluvial fans. What we'd like to do is sample some of those and look at the minerals and rock pieces that they contain and see if those match the sand in the ceramics. But just walking around the mausoleum, I've seen deposits and studied them by eye and seen that they contain a whole range, this diverse range of clasts. So they seem a good candidate. So here's Mount Lishan. The mountains here, and we've got these cones of alluvium material, of sand coming down from the rivers, and on top of the loess, and the mausoleum somewhere here. This is an image in the field of such a deposit within the mausoleum, the outer walls, and you can see it's got different grains of different composition. That's probably a piece of metamorphic rock. There's an iron-rich biotite there. So as a geologist, I trained as a geologist, I can see that matches quite well with the sand on a superficial level. So they may have derived their sand from these cones of juvenile polymix sand. It's unlikely that they would have transported the clay. So if we can locate the source of raw materials, then we can probably locate the production location, because they would have needed a huge amount, 1,000-odd tons of it to produce the 8,000 warriors. So they're unlikely to have transported that a long distance. It's going to be very bulky. So they're going to be the production location. My findings confirm the assumptions that it was produced somewhere in the area. And so hopefully ongoing further archaeological excavations will reveal some workshop debris or kilns containing fragments of warriors. One idea is possibly that they had finished producing all the warriors. There is an empty pit on the site, but the current idea is that that wasn't going to have any warriors in it, so one of the pits was left empty. But so they had possibly finished producing all the warriors and broke down the kilns and just taken them away because they would have needed the site for other uses. There are suggestions of various workshops working on the terracotta army, potentially state workshops and local workshops. From this small data set that I have got, unfortunately we can't shed any light from that. A previous study which looked at the chemistry of samples from 3 of the pits, the chemistry of warriors from 3 of the pits, found some differences between them, and this is something I would like to explore further. It's an interesting idea that different workshops are responsible for the populating of different, or for the warriors that went into different pits. I'll just show you their results. This is a means. This is a statistical means of classifying samples. Each of the points at the bottom, the numbers, are individual warrior samples, as well as a few clay samples, and it shows the hierarchical relationship between them. I've circled the samples from the various pits, and you can see that chemically, samples from pit 1 differ from samples of pit 3 and from pit 2. So I'd like to investigate these findings of a previous author in more detail. They took a chemical approach where you you just study the overall chemical composition of the sample. So they haven't looked at how the material was prepared. And we can't rule out that the different pits, the samples in the different pits, have somehow been altered during burial, preferentially altered compared to one another. So we might be looking at a preservational signal here rather than a real signal in terms of the raw materials that we used or the recipes. So I think microscopic investigations such as what I've showed you today need to be done on samples from pit 2 and 3 as well as pit 1. So that's hopefully going to be our next step. This link between if we can assume that the warriors and acrobats were produced at the site, when the links with the core material in the bronze birds is suggestive of the production location of these bronze artifacts. So that's quite a useful finding. It's likely that they wouldn't have produced the core at the site to cast the bronze bird and then taken it away. So probably the bronzes were cast at the site themselves. There has been some recent research, again with chemistry, looking at the composition of the core and comparing that to clay samples. And they found a mismatch between the local clay and the core material in the bronze birds, which suggests that it wasn't produced locally. However, my analysis of down the microscope of the core material shows that it's heavily corroded with copper that's washed in from the artifact around it, and that would have completely changed the chemical composition of the clay. The copper would have brought in all sorts of other elements, so we can't really trust that data, in my opinion. This is the publication. It shows a mismatch between chemistry of the clay samples and the chemistry of the core material, which I think is probably a preservational signal. So to conclude, by studying the ceramics of the terracotta warriors and other types of ceramic from the mausoleum, we've shed light on, helped to try and solve some issues about the technology through which they were produced. And we've shown that great care was taken to choose specific ingredients and blend them according to what sort of ceramic was being produced. It's likely that a local lurs was used. It's so abundant, and there wouldn't be no reason for the artisans to go a long distance to get that material. But we found by looking in detail at the sand within some of the artifacts that they probably used local alluvium close to the site and mixed that with it. And the link between the bronze birds and the acrobats, if we assume a local production of the acrobats and the warriors, shows us that those two were made close to the site. The additional thing we found is, of course, about the organisation production, that these different ceramic carts were linked, that the production of bronzes was also linked to the production of ceramics, so we may have had a cross-craft interaction, and we may have had a centralised part of this huge workforce that was responsible for the mausoleum may have been dedicated to extracting clay, the essential raw material that was needed, processing that and handing it out making it a standardized recipe and handing it out to various workshops. And I think this is a very key thing in the production of the mausoleum in such a short space of time. So my research is also a collaboration between myself and colleagues from the First Emperor's Mausoleum Museum, particularly the Conservation Department, who I'd like to acknowledge here. Thank you for listening.
I'll start off with the BBC question to Professor Zhang. Yeah. 是关于那个英国电台的，就是明天要发布的，他们把这个重点，起码宣传，把这个重点放在这个希腊的这个或者是雕塑家，或者是希腊的雕塑，可能已经在这个秦代的时候在中国出现了，请您谈一下这个课题。
是的，就像刚才我 PPT 展示的一些陶俑的形象，主要是那批百须俑，所以有些学者认为以百须俑为代表的一些陶俑，可能具有西方的因素或者具有希腊化的因素，但是实际上这是一个很复杂的问题。 至少我认为从3个方面来讲，这种认识还是有问题的。首先，从技术和材料方面来讲，这个兵马俑，包括百须俑，是传统的秦代的，或者是秦代本土做出来的。第二个方面呢，从这个文化因素来讲，比如说陶俑所着的衣服、陶俑的面貌、陶俑的人种，实际上全部是我们本土的东西。第3个方面，从这个文化因素，从这个这个思想上、理念上，因为在这之前，我们一直有用不同的材质制作俑的这个文化现象，比如说用竹、木、金属、石头做各种雕塑，一直有这个情况。另外还有一点，比如说刚才马克思教授展示的做兵马俑的一批工匠，中间有工匠，这个工匠，实际上做百须俑的这个工匠也是工匠。实际上从某种程度上讲，工匠既制作了百须俑，又制作了兵马俑。如果认为百须俑来自西方，那么来自希腊，那么兵马俑整个也来自希腊，或者是来自这个希腊化文化。同样的，铜身板，某种程度上讲，和陶俑和兵马俑没有本质的差别，都是名器，都是想象制作都是想象出来的东西，都是一种雕塑。那么整个这一批东西都具有西方的因素，那么实际上这个问题就相对来说，我认为是不能成立的。谢谢。
Okay, Professor Chan feels that the presence of the Greek, possible Greek sculptors or sculptures cannot be established because based on 3 points. Number one, in terms of technology and material, it is very much based on what is localized in terms of the source of material as well as the technology in creating the terracotta army. Second reason is the cultural context. In terms of the aesthetics, the idea of creating statues and so on, there is a longer history in China in doing so. And therefore, to think of the sudden appearance of the idea of having sculptures that that is just based on one influence, that is also unlikely. And thirdly is the broader ideological philosophical context of that. The idea of having barrier objects has a much longer history, and and they were done in different materials such as wood, metal, and so on. And there is a certain genealogy to the barrier objects, the creation of barrier objects in China. Now, I've asked the same question to our 2 other experts here. What do you think of this idea of the possibility of the presence of Greek sculpture or sculptors in Qing Shi Huang tomb?
Well, I think Dr. Janus made a very compelling argument, and I tend to agree with him. Perhaps the first thing that should be emphasized is that nothing of this is really a new claim. The possibility that there is Western influences in the construction of the whole First Emperor's Mausoleum is something that has been discussed for decades. There's only one reason why it's now in the media so prominently this week, and it is because of the TV program Tomorrow. So in that sense, there's no new discovery made this week that justifies it being in the media. And of course, while we should always engage with the media, there is the risk that you have to simplify a message into a single headline, and perhaps it appears more aggrandized and more exaggerated than it should be. So with that in mind, I think it seems reasonable to accept that there's some degree of Western contact. I mean, we knew before that there's Western minorities in China, before the first emperor. There influences in that, okay, you see, not for the first time, but you see more prominent figurative sculpture, you see more intense use of gold and silver, which you saw before, but not so much and not for the same things. Even it's been argued the use of clay bricks is something that was more popular in the West than it was in the East. But it's not surprising. Of course, East Asia is connected with Central Asia, which in turn is connected with Western Asia, and therefore the Hellenistic world. What would be surprising is if China was totally isolated. So contacts and cultural interaction, of course, existed. And we knew this. What is perhaps more questionable is that there were Greek sculptors or artisans at the imperial workshop producing terracotta army warriors. I think that's a simplification and perhaps an exaggeration for which we have no real evidence. So I think it's a matter of emphasis more than a matter of yes or no.
I don't have a lot to add to that, but just to say that nothing in our research, the Imperial Logistics Project, suggests that there could be a connection, but equally there's not much to rule it out. It's not really the aim of our investigations. And as Marcus said, too much emphasis being put on a single thing. There's a bit of a red herring to the other things we're trying to investigate.
Exactly. It's like, what we discussed today. I mean, we covered, with our three experts here, everything from cosmology to city planning to production organization to something as detailed as, looking at the clay through microscope. And this is the range of knowledge that we're interested in. Now, I will now open this to the audience, comments, questions, please.
Hi, for Professor Zhang, can you share a little bit about, in your hypnosis, you talk about the entire political system was brought into the tomb. So can you elaborate on that?
By political system, do you mean what, bureaucracy, or do you mean the social system?
For Professor Zhang,
yes.
He mentioned that the entire political system was brought by the emperor into the tomb.
这个就是问题是关于整个这个政治制度带进了这个题目里面。那请您讲一下这个政治制度指的是什么？
我恐怕没有这样讲了，不好意思。我是讲的是这个陵墓，实际上是体现了一种这种政治理念。这个政治理念是什么样呢？就是以这个皇帝为中心的一个模式，一个对天下的认识。
It's basically the political ideology of the emperor as being in the center of the world, and that whole ideology is captured in the tomb. Yes, sir.
To follow up on the issue of political, one of the major significant events in the Qing dynasty is the Sangyang Bianfa, the introduction of political change and the government system of governance. So it relates to what Professor Marcus spoke about, the decentralized production. For example, like the organization of Jun, Xian, Li, the governance from different geographical sites, and the production of, for example, the arrow quills. And have anybody done any study, for example, in Chinese certain dynasty, there's a certain department that says Gongbu that produce certain artifacts. Is there any literal recorded history versus your study of the logistics? Is there any correlation or any study on that? Thank you.
Yeah, in other words, relation between history and archaeology.
Yes, I think that is a very pertinent point and something we have done research on, the extent to which the organization of this microcosm that is the construction of the mausoleum may be a reflection of the broader macrocosm, the organization of an emerging empire. Because, of course, the first emperor had to deal with a very heterogeneous political landscape, different ethnic groups, different religions, loads of people who didn't know what an empire was. And it's interesting that here we find a parallel in that, as the gentleman was highlighting, the political system organized by the first emperor was to divide up the society in social solidarity groups in Wu. So there were no longer inheritable rights. People did not acquire any rights or privileges by blood, but they did by the services to the empire. And society was artificially separated in relatively small groups, which were collectively responsible for each other. So if one person in a group committed a crime, the whole group had to resolve it, or the whole group would be punished. And so it's very easy to now see that transposed into the creation of the Terracotta Army, where you have relatively small production groups which may have been collectively responsible for the quality of what they were doing. So that we see. Now, to the second part of your question, what would be fascinating is to see these in other political systems, how the political system correlates with the logistical, technological control. The problem is that we have no real comparison anywhere. We are being very explicit in how we publish our research methods with the hope they can be applied to other systems, to the construction of a Roman amphitheatrum, to the construction of an Egyptian pyramid, so we can compare how different political systems are translated in different models of technological control. But at the moment, we don't have the data to produce any meaningful comparisons.
Okay, just very briefly， 这个刚才我们谈到的问题就是关于这个政治制度跟这个生产的组织的关系。好，下一个问题 ，next please.
I want to ask the speakers regarding the aero technology, because the Qingsu one is very famous for using the mechanization of the aero. Does the aero system come from the Chinese, or it came from the West, from the Romans? I mean.
You want me to? Yeah, of course. I'm happy to answer that, or to try. So, if I understood the question correctly, it has to do with the crossbow trigger mechanism, and again, where it was invented. Perhaps, again, the first thing to say is that archaeologists are less and less obsessed about putting the finger on this is the first of anything, because as soon as you put your finger on this is the earliest of anything, somebody else will come up with something. This is 2 years earlier or 1 century earlier. And that's bound to happen. It's happened a million times before. What we can certainly say, it was the Chinese who first used crossbows on a large scale, on a strategic scale, mass-produced, and clearly giving them an edge at battle. So the evidence certainly is that if they didn't invent the crossbow, they certainly developed it to a much more successful strategic scale. I don't know if that answers the question, probably not. But in a way, personally, and I'm not the only one, I find it more interesting to try to understand how people in the past did things, how people in the past made things related to each other and to the environment, than to always obsessing about who was the first at doing something. And that's often what archaeologists are kind of narrowed into. Who was the first at doing this or that? It's interesting, but there are other interesting questions.
Okay, thank you. And you first.
我想请问张卫星教授，有没有具体计划开挖秦始皇的陵寝？主要面对什么问题？因为挖这个定陵啊，损坏了很多文物。
没有计划。如果要开挖的话，会面临很多问题。首先，我们对这个墓葬的内部的结构，实际上我们现在不清楚，所以根本无从谈计划的问题。其次，肯定会面临到技术上的难度。最后一个，我觉得另外还有一个问题，如果开挖的话，我们需要把这个景观破坏掉，这可能谁都不敢做出这个决定。
So the question is on whether the central barrier chamber will be excavated. Yeah? Okay, next, sir.
Yeah, can I just ask, from the arrows or from the faces of the terracotta warriors, is there any evidence of the amalgamation of different armies? Because after all, the Qin vanquished all 6 or all 7 others? And from the organizational standpoint, are there any integration? And then the other question is, 那请问兵马俑还有那个汉文帝的那个俑最大的不同在哪里？
I can answer the first one, but not the second one. As for the first question, if I understood you correctly, you're asking if there are different ethnic groups possibly represented in the facial features? Yeah. So in the weapons, we see nothing that could speak of regional or cultural differentiation. We see massive standardization, and everything is very Qin. Everything is very state of Qin, which is the state that expanded. In the faces of the warriors, there has no been systematic study of the way we are beginning on the faces. We're hoping to do it, but we're only beginning. So more qualitatively, it has been suggested that different ethnic groups are represented. If you look around, there will be faces that people will say look more Han, faces that people say look more Inner Mongolian because of the shape of their chins or their eyes. Of course, these are risky areas, kind of categorizing people just by the way their faces look. But yes, you can certainly see groups of warriors that would assign to different families by the shape of their heads or their faces. The question is, does that mean they are portraits of real people? Does that mean that it's a deliberate attempt at portraying those different races? Does that mean that the artisans themselves were of different races and they are depicting their own race? We don't know.
Okay.
我回答一下刚才那位先生的关于俑的不同。实际上，秦俑和汉俑最大的不同，首先是体量的不同，和这是很直观的。其实背后一个最核心的问题是，秦俑，包括兵马俑，包括百奚俑，包括其他的俑，秦代的俑，全是手工，每一个单独制作的，而汉俑是模型化做出来的，这是背后的最大的不同。
The answer here is what's the difference between Han figurines and Qing figurines? The answer is Qing figurine is each is made by hands, it's handmade, whereas the Han figurine is done through models, so there is a greater standardization. Understand? Yeah? Okay. So there were 2 questions, and we will just take the 2 final questions or comments. Yeah.
I have to say that this is something that, as I said explicitly, is not the primary focus of our research. That is the military history and how armies were organized. There are publications on the subject, which I could point you to, that try to use the Terracotta Army as a proxy for what the Qin army was like. In a nutshell, this army, large and impressive as it is likely much smaller than what a real battle formation would look in the Qin period. The problem is that we are using the archaeological evidence as a proxy for what a real army might have looked like, and there are risks there. But there are studies of these and indeed comparisons with Western armies, but it's not something I can really say much about because I'm not a specialist in military history. I don't think any has been raised.
There was one question there just now. There were, here, yeah.
I want to ask a question. What's the passion for you to study the Bing Ma Yong for so long time? And if you got one book to recommend to the audience, what's the book you want to recommend?
Whom are you asking, sorry?
First one is, what's the passion for all these 3 professors to study this Terracotta Army? And if you got one book to recommend to the audience, what's the book you want to recommend?
Many books. Well, start by the authors here. You got the names, right? Yeah, I would recommend. Yeah, start with the authors here, right? And I think we are all very passionate, as we could see today. I mean, we covered so many subjects. It's like, seeing a different world, and more than 2,000 years ago, and it covers everything, from production, design, engineering, city planning, absolutely everything. So I think the kind of passion we have is one of the kind of desire for knowledge, of a comparison, of something so distant away and yet, you know, such a wonder. Now, 1, 2, thank you. Yes, the question here?
Thank you. Yeah, we understand that Emperor Qing ruled for 11 years. Then, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 11 years. Right, then for this to build, to construct a mausoleum of this magnitude, when did he start constructing, or how many years? I mean, he can't be constructing before 11 years, or the day that he became emperor, then he start constructing, preparing for his death. Any ideas how long he took to prepare? Thank you.
这个问题我们问一下张教授啊，就是秦始皇本身他这个执政的年代可能比这个墓的这个策划的亡灵的策划年代还要短。那他是什么时候开始的策划？
文献记载很明确，就是他刚继位，就当王子当王的时候，秦王的时候就开始修建陵墓。但是这个可能是他37年，这37年，从他13岁开始继位的时候就开始修建陵墓。但是我们可以想象，他统一之前，这个陵墓不会大规模修建，大规模修建的就是26年，他统一天下了以后的从26年开始到37年他死，这12年间是一个大规模修建陵墓的时代。
So during his whole reign, entire range period of his reign. Final question. Thank you.
I'm very curious about the consistency of manufacturing. So when you examine the artifacts, do you see a consistent quality exhibited by the manufacturers, or are there instances where you see there are occasions where the manufacturers cut corners, so you see a drop in quality? I examine quite a lot of pottery myself, so I see that happening in pottery. So I'm wondering if in this situation, do you observe such characteristics?
You're trying to get me in trouble, right? I'm glad that I don't have to lie when I say that I don't see any evidence for cutting corners, but it's a very pertinent question. What we see is extremely high standardization and very high production quality, which is quite surprising for something that's going to be put in a tomb effectively. For example, the fact that every one of those arrowheads has been sharpened and made lethal shows that no corners were cut, no efforts were spared. And that's, as far as I have seen, you see across all the manufacturing details, optimum materials, optimum production processes, and no savings really.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Mrs. Chong, can I invite the chairperson of the Lian Feng's colloquium?
明年是梁思成和林徽因他们发现五台山脚下的佛光石80年，所以我请梁思成和林徽因的孙子梁健先生和天津大学建筑考古系的系主任来讲发现中国最老的木造建筑佛光寺。应该是明年2月18号。
So please join me in thanking Professor Martino Torres, Professor Chan, and Professor Kim. Thank you.